On 28 of February 2018, Maplin, Britain's defining high-street electronics chain, entered administration, putting 2,500 jobs at risk and signaling the end for 217 stores across the United Kingdom. For over 4 decades, Maplin had been the physical emergency room for British makers, PC builders, and engineers. From custom resistors and soldering irons to specialized cables, it was where Britain went when technology broke or needed to be built by hand. Within months, every storefront was cleared, leaving empty windows on high streets from Aberdeen to Plymouth. The paradox was cruel. The British public was consuming more technology, screens, and consumer gadgets than at any point in history. Yet the country's most famous physical tech retailer could no longer survive. But the real story of Maplin is not merely about a high street retail collapse. It is the story of how Britain learned to build technology and what happened when a nation decided to only buy it. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, shops, software houses, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story of Maplin begins not with a high street collapse, but with a specific place in a small bedroom in Rayleigh-on-Waes, Essex in 1972. The story begins in 1972 in a spare bedroom in Rayleigh, Essex. At the time, Britain's relationship with technology was highly physical and largely disconnected. If you were a hobbyist building a synthesizer, a ham radio operator, or an electronics enthusiast trying to fix a broken amplifier, your access to components was frustratingly fragmented. There was no single place to buy the precise resistor, capacitor, or transistor you needed. You had to scour small, specialized magazines, send off postal orders to disparate suppliers, and wait weeks for a package to arrive, often hoping the part was correct. Roger Allen, a young electronic engineer, and his wife Sandra recognized this friction. They saw that the problem was not a lack of interest in electronics, it was a lack of a coherent retail system. They started Maplin Electronic Supplies as a mail-order business, operating entirely out of their home. The premise was simple: consolidate the chaotic world of electronic components into a single, reliable source. In a pre-internet world, the only way to prove you had inventory was to print it. And so, Maplin created its first catalog. That early catalog, initially just a few dozen pages, was a revelation for the British maker community. It did not merely list parts, it categorized them logically, provided specifications, and offered a reliable way to order them. It was a mail-order promise that you could build complex technology from scratch if you had the right guide. The response was overwhelming. The bedroom in Essex quickly ran out of space. By 1974, Maplin had outgrown the mail-order model alone and opened its first physical shop on London Road in Westcliff-on-Sea. This first shop established the blueprint for what Maplin would become. It was not a glamorous showroom. It was a functional space, defined by a massive counter and a wall of hundreds of small, labeled drawers containing every conceivable electronic component. The staff behind the counter were not traditional salespeople. They were enthusiasts and engineers who could look at a customer's hand-drawn circuit diagram and pull the exact parts needed to make it work. Maplin had successfully turned a complex, niche hobby into a structured retail experience. But the company's true breakthrough was yet to come. The catalog had taught enthusiasts how to buy components. The next decade would teach the entire country how to build computers. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw a fundamental shift in the British digital landscape. The arrival of the home computer, machines like the Sinclair ZX81, the colorful ZX Spectrum, and the public service promise of the BBC Micro, transformed the British bedroom from a place of sleep into a makeshift laboratory. A home computer, a machine sold for household use, usually connected to a living room television and loaded with software from a standard cassette tape, meant that for the first time, computing power was not locked away in a university lab or a corporate office. It was sitting on a kitchen table in Birmingham or a bedroom desk in Manchester. But these early British machines were inherently limited by what they could physically connect to in the real world. If a teenager wanted their ZX Spectrum to control a homemade robotic arm, or a teacher wanted a BBC Micro to monitor the temperature of a school greenhouse, They could not simply buy a boxed, plug-and-play solution. They had to build the electronic interface themselves. This required printed circuit boards, soaring irons, specific arrays of resistors, and exact lengths of ribbon cable. Maplin quickly became the vital supply line for this new generation of bedroom coders and hardware hackers. The company realized that they were no longer just selling replacement fuses or parts for broken analog radios. They were fueling a national wave of digital and electronic creation. The difference between Maplin and a standard high-street tech retailer like Dixon's was stark, and this distinction became the foundation of their success. A shop like Dixon's sold you a finished television, a packaged hi-fi system, or a boxed computer. It sold you the end of a manufacturing process. Maplin, by contrast, sold you the beginning. If a customer walked into a Maplin shop in 1982 and asked how to make a computer beep, the staff would not point them to a finished speaker on a shelf. They would sell them a piezo transducer, some copper wire, a 5555 timer chip, and a schematic diagram, effectively saying, "Here are the pieces. Build it yourself." This turned a simple retail transaction into a deliberate culture of learning. To feed this growing hunger for practical knowledge, Maplin did not just expand its mail-order catalog. It launched a dedicated educational and hobbyist publication, Electronics. The Maplin magazine began in 1981 and quickly became a staple on W. H. Smith and John Menzies magazine shelves across the UK. The magazine featured incredibly detailed, step-by-step projects, ranging from simple audio amplifiers and guitar distortion pedals to complex home security systems, weather stations, and computer interfaces. A printed circuit board, a flat board that mechanically supports and electrically connects electronic components, could be ordered directly from Maplin via the magazine, alongside a specific bag of parts needed to populate it. For a teenager or a hobbyist in the mid-1980s, waiting for the postman to deliver a Maplin Jiffy bag containing an assortment of logic chips, LEDs, and capacitors was a distinctly British tech ritual. The magazine did not just advertise products, it provided the educational glue that held the entire maker ecosystem together. It proved to the British public that technology was not a sealed black box imported from abroad. It was something that could be understood, modified, and mastered at home. This philosophy created a fiercely loyal user base. Maplin was not merely a shop, it was an enabler of ideas. By the late 1980s, the physical footprint of the company began to expand significantly to meet this demand. Moving well beyond its Essex roots, Maplin began opening dedicated stores in major cities across the UK. Places like Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, and Southampton saw the arrival of the distinctive Maplin signage. The layout of these new stores remained heavily biased towards the builder, rather than the passive consumer. The focal point of every shop was always the main counter, behind which stood the legendary wall of components drawers. Thousands of tiny, meticulously labeled plastic trays held every conceivable part. To buy something at Maplin meant engaging in a technical dialogue. You had to speak to the staff, explain your project, and ensure you were buying a 10-kilo ohm resistor rather than a 10-ohm one. The staff were overwhelmingly enthusiasts themselves, often former or current electrical engineers, who could spot a flaw in a customer's hand-drawn circuit diagram before ringing up the till. As the 1980s home computer boom transitioned into the early 1990s, the nature of British computing began to shift. The bespoke, idiosyncratic machines of Sinclair and Acorn were slowly giving way to the encroaching global standard of the IBM-compatible personal computer. A personal computer architecture, a standardized system of motherboards, processors, and expansion cards, meant that a machine bought for a home office could be continually upgraded by the user rather than replaced entirely. This standardization could have easily been a threat to a traditional electronics component supplier, but Maplin adapted brilliantly to the changing ecosystem. They expanded their massive inventory to include PC components, internal ribbon cables, basic graphics cards, and memory upgrades. They positioned themselves not just as a shop for hardcore electronics engineers with soldering irons, but as the essential supplier for the burgeoning PC building community. If a hard drive failed on a Friday evening, or a university student needed a specific serial cable to connect a modem, a device that let computers send data over phone lines to early online services. Maplin was the only place on the high street that could solve the problem immediately. The brand had conquered the bedroom hobbyist. Now it prepared to conquer the British high street. By the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Maplin had achieved a scale that made it an undeniable fixture of the British high street. The company had long since moved out of the mail-order bedroom in Essex. It was now a national retail empire. At its absolute zenith, Maplin operated over 200 stores across the United Kingdom, cementing its physical presence in major cities from London and Bristol to Leeds, Edinburgh, Sheffield, and Nottingham. This era represented the undisputed peak of British physical tech retail access. Maplin had become the definitive tech emergency room for the entire country. The cultural footprint of the brand was built around a specific British weekend ritual. For an entire generation of enthusiasts, walking into a Maplin on a Saturday afternoon was a distinct sensory and educational experience. The shops had a specific atmosphere, a faint but recognizable smell of warm plastic, coiled copper, and the lingering scent of flux from soldering stations. It was a space that felt fundamentally different from any other electronics shop on the high street. The layout of a classic Maplin store was a deliberate statement of intent. Unlike a branch of Dixon's or Curry's, which dedicated their most valuable floor space to gleaming rows of identical box televisions and prepackaged consumer electronics, the absolute centerpiece of Maplin was the components counter. Behind this counter stood a massive ceiling-high wall of thousands of small transparent plastic drawers. Those drawers held the DNA of British computing and electronics. They contained every conceivable value of resistor, capacitor, transistor, diode, and switch. To purchase from the wall required a dialogue. You could not simply pick a part off a shelf and walk to an automated till. You had to approach the counter, state your requirement, and speak to the staff. And the staff were the vital human engine of the entire operation. They were rarely standard retail workers. They were overwhelmingly hobbyists, electronic engineering students, amateur radio operators, and weekend PC builders. If a customer walked in holding the burnt-out circuit board of a broken household appliance or a hand-drawn diagram for a bespoke robotic project, the staff did not just point to an aisle. They diagnosed the issue, pulled the exact 10 kilo-ohm resistor from a specific drawer, and often offered advice on the best temperature for the soldering iron required to fit it. This physical interaction was supported by the ultimate symbol of the company's power, the Maplin catalogue. What had started as a thin mail-order pamphlet had evolved into a monumental brick of paper. Sold at the tills and sitting prominently on W.H. Smith magazine shelves nationwide, the catalog was often thicker than a city telephone directory. It was not merely a retail brochure, it was the definitive encyclopedia of British hardware. Every length of coaxial cable, every specific interface standard, every motherboard, and every obscure tool was meticulously photographed, specified, and priced. For thousands of teenagers and engineers, browsing the catalog was an education in itself. The 1990s also brought a new kind of customer to the counter. The bedroom coder with a soldering iron was being joined by the PC builder. A personal computer, a modular system of motherboards, graphics cards, and hard drives, required a constant supply of internal cables, cooling fans, and memory upgrades. Maplin adapted to this shift flawlessly. They became the primary high street destination for anyone building or upgrading a PC. If a university student in Manchester needed a specific SCSI cable to connect an external drive, or a gamer in Glasgow needed a new graphics card to run the latest software, Maplin was the only physical location that guaranteed they could walk out with the part in their hand that same day. They provided the physical infrastructure for the early days of British internet adoption too. When dial-up internet gave way to early broadband, Maplin was the place to buy the long Ethernet cables, the physical network cords needed to string connectivity from a hallway telephone socket to a bedroom desk. In a British town where consumer electronics were increasingly sold as sealed, unrepairable black boxes, the right physical shop did not merely sell cables. It decided who could fix their own machines, who understood the hardware beneath the screen, who could build a computer from raw parts, and who felt that technology was something to be mastered rather than passively consumed. As the late 1990s dissolved into the early 2000s, Maplin's retail footprint evolved. The brand began to aggressively colonize out-of-town retail parks alongside standard high street units. These new larger stores, often situated next to massive branches of PC World or Currys, featured the iconic blue and white signage that became a familiar beacon for anyone experiencing a sudden digital crisis. This era marked a golden age for a specific kind of consumer, the custom PC builder. As personal computers moved from luxury items to household necessities, a massive subculture emerged around building, modifying, and upgrading these machines by hand. Maplin was perfectly positioned to supply this boom. The stores dedicated entire aisles to internal hardware. If you were building a gaming rig, you did not just buy a gray metal box. You bought clear acrylic cases, neon cold cathode lighting tubes, aftermarket cooling fans, and complex water cooling systems. Maplin sold the motherboard standoffs, the IDE cables, wide flat ribbon cables used to connect hard drives to the main board, and the tiny tubes of thermal paste, the heat-conductive compound required to safely attach a processor to a heatsink. For a brief, glorious window, Maplin was the undisputed king of the Friday night tech emergency. If a home network went down, if a power supply blew in the middle of an important university dissertation, or if a crucial audio adapter was lost hours before a gig, waiting for a mail-order delivery was not an option. You got in the car, drove to the nearest Maplin retail park, and bought the part. The premium price on the shelf was a willingly paid tax for immediate physical availability. The staff remained the crucial differentiator. The people wearing the Maplin uniforms were still, by and large, the people who read the magazines and built the machines. They could physically test a faulty fuse, advise on the correct wattage for a replacement laptop charger, or explain the difference between a standard router and an ADSL modem, the specific device required to translate an analog phone line signal into a digital broadband connection. In an era before YouTube repair tutorials were easily accessible, the Maplin counter was the primary search engine for British hardware problems. This physical dominance was anchored by the final, monumental iterations of the Maplin catalogue. By the mid-2000s, the catalogue had become a colossal, telephone directory-sized brick. It was updated multiple times a year, packed with thousands of densely printed pages detailing everything from discrete logic chips to complete DJ mixing desks. It was a staple of British teenage bedrooms, poured over like a wish list of pure potential. To look through the catalog was to understand the sheer scale of the electronic world. It proved that any device, no matter how complex, was simply a collection of understandable, purchasable parts. In a British landscape where one shop might serve an entire town's technical needs, the right high street presence did not merely supply components. It decided who could fix their own machines, who discovered the logic of circuit boards, who learned to upgrade rather than discard, and who felt that the digital future was something they could literally hold in their hands. Maplin had reached its absolute zenith. It was a nationwide empire built on the assumption that people wanted to build, fix, and understand their technology. It had become the definitive physical home for British technology, but technology was about to stop needing a physical home. The decline of Maplin did not begin with a financial crash, a sudden mass closure, or a dramatic press release. The first crack was almost invisible, happening quietly on the shop floor. A regular customer walking into a branch in the late 2000s would have noticed a subtle but profound shift in the geography of the store. The great wall of component drawers, the thousands of tiny plastic trays holding the raw DNA of British electronics, the very foundation of the brand, was no longer the first thing you saw. It had been physically pushed to the back of the shop. What replaced it at the entrance was a stark indicator of a shifting corporate mindset. The premium front-of-house shelves were increasingly dominated by remote-controlled helicopters, novelty USB gadgets, generic disco lights, and imported unbranded CCTV kits. The shop that had once taught Britain how to solder a motherboard and wire a bespoke network was now trying to sell them plastic toys. This was a classic case of brand dilution. Facing the encroaching pressure of general high street retailers like Currys and the early rumblings of e-commerce, Maplin's management attempted to pivot from a specialist supplier into a broad consumer electronics retailer. They wanted to capture the casual high street shopper, but in doing so, they alienated their core user base. The enthusiast who used to spend an hour discussing capacitor voltages and circuit schematics with the staff felt increasingly out of place among aisles of flashing novelty clocks and cheap drones. The staff themselves, once the vital, knowledgeable human engine of the business, were gradually replaced. The hobbyists and electrical engineering students were swapped for standard retail workers who, through no fault of their own, could not confidently read a circuit diagram or advise on the specific thermal paste required for a processor. The transaction was no longer an educational dialogue. It was just a purchase. At the same time, the fundamental premise of Maplin, that you needed a physical shop to buy specialized technical parts, was being systematically dismantled by the internet. Early online retail had been slow and largely mistrusted, but by the 2010s, platforms like Amazon, eBay, and direct shipping sites from Chinese manufacturers offered an infinite, searchable catalog. If a hobbyist needed an Arduino microcontroller, a small, programmable circuit board used for modern DIY tech projects, they no longer had to drive to a retail park on a Saturday. They could order it online for a fraction of the cost with next-day delivery. Maplin was caught on the wrong side of Force 4, global scale and convenience displacement. This shift exposed a brutal reality regarding Maplin's pricing. The convenience tax that the brand charged for having physical inventory on a British high street became glaringly obvious to a consumer base that was now permanently connected to the internet. A standard HDMI cable, a digital lead used to connect a computer or set-top box to a television or monitor, could cost upwards of $20 in a Maplin store. The exact same specification of cable could be bought on Amazon for $3. Maplin inadvertently became a victim of showrooming. A customer facing a Friday night tech emergency might still walk into the shop to physically inspect a router or a hard drive enclosure, but they would instantly check the price on their mobile phone. Seeing the massive markup, they would simply order the item online while standing in the Maplin aisle, perfectly willing to wait 24 hours to save $30. The shop was providing the physical browsing experience, but global online platforms were taking the revenue. Furthermore, the nature of British technology use was changing. The era of the heavily modified beige desktop PC was fading. Consumers were shifting towards laptops, tablets, and eventually smartphones. Sealed, glued, and unrepairable monolithic slabs of glass and aluminium. When a device broke, you did not buy a soldering iron and a replacement capacitor. You either threw it away or took it to a manufacturer's official repair center. The culture of the bedroom coder and the weekend PC builder was shrinking. Software was moving to the cloud, remote servers processing data via internet connections, meaning local hardware upgrades were less vital. To compound the loss of physical identity, the iconic Maplin catalog, once the size of a telephone directory and revered as a British tech encyclopedia, grew thinner before being phased out entirely. It was replaced by a website that, while functional, lacked the tactile magic of the paper version and struggled to compete with the algorithmic efficiency of Amazon. The brand was losing its identity, its core users, and its reason to exist on the high street. But the fatal blow would not come solely from the changing customer. It would come from the people who now own the shops. Behind the scenes, the structure that held Maplin up was fundamentally changing. In 2004, and again in 2014, the company was acquired by private equity firms. A private equity buyout often places immense pressure on a retail chain to maximize short-term profits, aggressively expand, and service significant debt. For a business that originally built its reputation on stocking thousands of low-margin, highly specific electronic components in physical stores, this financial model was a suffocating mismatch. The cost of maintaining over 200 physical locations on British high streets and retail parks was astronomical. Commercial rent, business rates, and the wages of thousands of staff had to be paid regardless of whether a customer walked in to buy a $500 drone or a 50p resistor. To compensate for these massive physical overheads, Maplin had to inflate prices across the board. They were trapped in a vicious cycle. They needed high prices to pay for the physical shops, but those high prices drove their customers out of the shops and onto the internet. By 2017, the retail environment in the United Kingdom was becoming increasingly hostile for physical electronics chains. Maplin attempted a final, desperate pivot. Recognizing that the era of the PC builder was waning, they experimented with smart home installations. They offered free tech support in store, trying to leverage their remaining unique asset, human staff. They rebranded themselves as smart home experts, hoping to sell networked light bulbs, wireless thermostats, and security cameras to a public that was ostensibly confused by the Internet of Things. But the market had already moved on. The British public did not need a physical shop to explain a smart thermostat. They were already watching video tutorials on their smartphones and buying the equipment directly from global platforms. The ecosystem that Maplin relied on, the enthusiast, the builder, the hobbyist who needed physical parts today, had evolved. The modern maker was buying Arduinos and Raspberry Pis directly from specialist websites. The casual consumer was buying sealed smartphones and tablets. Neither needed a massive high-street shop with a components counter pushed to the back. Maplin was also losing the Friday night tech emergency. The nature of digital failure had changed. If a hard drive failed in 2002, you rushed to Maplin for a recovery cable or a replacement drive because your data was entirely local. By 2015, if a laptop failed, the user's data was often safely backed up in a cloud service, a remote server farm storing files over the internet. The panic was gone. The immediate need for a physical component was replaced by the minor inconvenience of waiting for a next-day internet delivery. Force 1, supply chains and manufacturing costs, and Force 4, global scale and convenience displacement, were systematically crushing Force 2, retail access. Maplin could not compete with the limitless, frictionless inventory of global e-commerce, nor could it survive on the shrinking margins of British high street retail. The end, when it came, was rapid and brutal. In early 2018, facing a severe cash flow crisis, credit insurers pulled their cover. This meant Maplin had to pay suppliers upfront for stock, an impossible demand for a retailer already drowning in debt and struggling with declining footfall. They sought a rescue buyer, but the market looked at the balance sheet, looked at the expensive high street leases, and walked away. The rent was too high. The footfall dropped. The margins collapsed. The core users stayed online. On 28 February 2018, Maplin collapsed. Administrators were called in. A buyer was not found. The closing down sales began. The component drawers were emptied. The shelves were stripped bare. Thousands of staff were let go. The doors were locked. The signs were pulled down. The high street had lost its tech emergency room. But the name still had one last place to go. In the immediate aftermath of the 2018 collapse, when the final 217 shops were locked, the signs pulled down, and the last of the inventory was auctioned off to liquidators, the Maplin name did not entirely vanish. The intellectual property, the famous logo, the customer database, and the domain name, was quietly purchased. In 2019, Maplin relaunched, but it returned purely as an online-only storefront. It had become a zombie brand, a corporate ghost occupying a digital space. You can still type the address into a browser today and see the familiar blue and white branding. But the modern website is entirely divorced from the culture in the physical ecosystem that built the name. There is no components counter. There is no wall of thousands of transparent plastic drawers housing the raw DNA of electronics. There are no former electrical engineering students working the tills, ready to diagnose a faulty circuit board or advise on the correct gauge of wire for a custom home audio project. Instead, it is simply another generic e-commerce site, functioning largely on a drop-shipping model, selling imported power banks, packaged charging cables, and standard, unbranded CCTV kits. The logo survived. The educational ecosystem it once represented was completely erased. What was actually lost when the physical shops closed was not just a retail brand. It was the definitive physical infrastructure of British technological literacy. For decades, the high street had a place that proved technology was not magic. It was just hardware. It was a collection of parts that could be unscrewed, diagnosed, understood, and repaired. When Maplin disappeared, that physical proof vanished with it. The modern British high street offers dozens of places to buy a sealed, glued-together smartphone, a completely unrepairable tablet, or a flat-screen television that acts as a black box, but it no longer offers a single national destination to help you understand how the hardware beneath the glass actually works. It is easy to view the peak years of Maplin through a lens of pure nostalgia, to long for the distinct smell of warm solder and heated plastic in the aisles, or to fondly remember the childhood ritual of carrying home a catalog the size of a telephone directory. But the legacy of the company must pass a stricter test. Nostalgia is not enough. The history of Maplin matters because an old, heavy catalog or a surviving paper receipt proves that there was a time when the British public demanded ownership over their machines. The original Maplin existed because people actively wanted to upgrade their own computer memory, wire their own complex home networks, and fix their own broken amplifiers. It proves that the modern transition to unrepairable, disposable consumer electronics was a market choice dictated by convenience and corporate control, not a technological inevitability. The deepest irony of Maplin's collapse is one of historical timing. Today, there is a massive, growing global push for the right to repair. Governments and consumer rights groups are beginning to demand that technology manufacturers provide spare parts, open up their sealed devices, and allow ordinary people to fix their own machines to reduce catastrophic electronic waste. Yet just as this movement is gaining serious legislative and cultural traction, Britain lacks the exact high street infrastructure that was originally built to serve it. Maplin was the ultimate right to repair headquarters, crushed by the brutal economics of the internet and commercial rent just mere years before repairing hardware became a crucial environmental and cultural priority again. Today, the true spirit of Maplin does not live on its modern algorithmic website. It survives in the sheds, lofts, and spare box rooms of the British maker community. It survives on vintage computing forums, where enthusiasts still trade specific pin connectors, capacitors, and logic chips to keep Sinclair ZX Spectrums, BBC Micros, and early custom PC builds running. It lives in the charity shop tech bins, where a faded plastic bag bearing the old blue logo still holds a carefully sorted jumble of five timer chips, diodes, and copper wire. The physical stores are gone, but the raw materials and the knowledge they distributed are still powering the British hardware preservation movement today. The story of Maplin is the story of a fundamental shift in how a nation interacts with the future. Force 4, global scale and convenience displacement, did not just change where the British public shopped, it changed what they expected from their machines. Britain did not stop consuming technology. It simply lost the physical system that turned passive consumers into active builders. The boundless convenience of the internet provided infinite searchable inventory, but it permanently removed the human dialogue from the transaction. A society traded the messy educational reality of the components counter for the frictionless, silent efficiency of a next-day delivery box. The high street still has windows, but the customer is already online, buying a replacement rather than learning how to make a repair. Yet somewhere in a British loft, sitting on a dusty shelf next to a cold soldering iron and a brittle plastic tray of assorted resistors, a dog-eared 1998 Maplin catalog still holds its weight, silently proving that there was once a time when the future was something you built by hand. See you in the next one.